Good afternoon. We are now live. Welcome to Paths Tuesday Table Talk. Today's topic, the Great Reopening. How do patients and caregivers feel? I'd like to welcome our audience. Thanks again for joining us on our regularly scheduled Tuesday Table Talk. We're happy to have today Nikki Montgomery and Sherry Berman, who will be joining our conversation. I'm really privileged to have both of them here today to talk about something I know many of us have been discussing for months. And now that we've moved into reopening our states, there's a lot of fear and anxiety around that. So let me first introduce myself. I am Hala Dura. I'm a patient family engagement consultant and also founder of PATH, which is Patient Advocates Transforming Healthcare. We are a diverse coalition of patient, family, caregiver, and community engagement leaders, really looking to share our expertise and our experiences personally and professionally to transform healthcare and really have that true patient, caregiver, family, and community partnered work together. I'm going to first introduce Nikki. Nikki Montgomery is a patient advocate and the past president of the Patient and Family Partnership Council at University Hospitals, Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. She is also the project coordinator for the Barrel Institute's Patient Experience Policy Forum, also known as the PXPF, and serves on the Global Patient and Family Advisory Board. As a parent of a child with complex medical needs, she has spent lots of time in healthcare settings and is interested in improving equity, engagement, and communication with patients. Thanks again, Nikki, for joining us. We also have with us today Sherry Berman. Sherry has had cancer twice, and after also losing her mother to cancer, and unfortunately a very bad patient experience with that, she left her job in human resources and hoped to improve the patient experience for others. She led the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute PFAC. She's also done national work and more recently serves as the co-chair of the Patient Experience Policy Forum at the Barrel Institute. So she works very closely with Nikki as well. And she's also a writer and blogger of many of her experiences. And Sherry, maybe later you can share your blog where people can find your blogging, because it's really great writing and great work, and we appreciate you sharing that. I also want to remind our audience today that if you are subscribed onto YouTube and have a YouTube account, please feel free to share your comments and questions in the chat box. You can share them at any time. I will be able to share those with Nikki and Sherry as we discuss this very important topic today. So please don't hesitate to go ahead and put those questions and comments in the chat box. So here we are today, the great reopening of America. Many of our states now have moved into, in many cases, stage 2 and stage 3, which means a lot of different things depending on which state you're in. I know in my state of Maryland, that means we have restaurants open again at a certain capacity. We have gyms open again. We have malls. We have a lot of retail that's open. So basically easing into really trying to get to a point where things are reopened at the places they were pre-COVID. Obviously, hospitals and health systems have really spent a lot of time recently trying to reassure the public that it is safe, quote unquote, to come back into the hospital or see your primary care physician in the outpatient settings to make sure that you are monitoring your health. But again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, that brings a lot of fear and anxiety, whether you're a patient or a caregiver. And in my situation as a caregiver of 5 children, one of whom is medically complex and is immune compromised, it's really nerve-wracking when your child is saying, well, now the malls are open, can't we go? And your heart just kind of stops because you're like, no, I'm scared. I don't know what this means. And I think to add to all that fear and anxiety is the confusion surrounding where should we seek guidance? Where can we go, whether it's from, government leadership or from, obviously our own medical teams. what guidance can they offer us? And I know there's a lot of unknowns right now, but at the same time, it's hard to figure out, well, what do I do next? How long do I quarantine myself and my family? When do we get to a place where we start to feel like we can, quote unquote, reopen our own lives? And so today's conversation is really going to be based around those issues, and perhaps sharing our feelings may open up conversations on a broader scale, whether it's public health officials or with healthcare leaders and health systems, on how do we really address this fear and anxiety, and how do we really provide solid evidence-based guidance that can really direct the choices that we will face and continue to face in the midst of this pandemic. I think to highlight now, we see so many states with spikes, and that is something that also one fears, and a lot more people are traveling and moving around again. So I think there's a lot of confusion and a lot of fear out there, and we're hoping today that we can start to talk through some of that. So Nikki, I know that you have a child who's medically complex, so I'm sure you're feeling a lot of the same things that I mentioned, but I'd love to hear your take on how are you feeling right now? What guidance do you hope and wish that you could have to really make some of those decisions, and really sharing what that means to you and your family?
Thanks, Hala. I'm glad to share what our perspectives are. So, my son is 8 years old and he has a complex medical condition that affects his muscles. And so that means that he doesn't clear his lungs very well. He's really susceptible to pneumonias. And this is on an average year when we're not having a pandemic. So, right now, we're really hunkering down still and staying as close to home as possible and not really engaging in going out. We only have sought medical care that was absolutely necessary. And some of it I put off until it was absolutely necessary, just because it's really scary to take him into those environments. And as we plan to go forward, it's hard to know what's safe. So our son has in-home care, and I couldn't get any solid advice on, should you keep having in-home care? It's something that families have had to juggle. Do I sleep or do I have someone come in who's an additional risk to my household? And that alone is kind of a scary thing, especially because the only safety check we have available is to take their temperature on the way in and ask them to report symptoms. But what does that really mean for our safety? We don't know entirely. And there's no good advice that says, hey, if your care providers are doing this, this, and this, you should not have them come into your home. I did find a resource that said maybe you shouldn't employ people still who are employed at nursing homes as their other job or something, and people who have wider exposures. But it's still hard to make that judgment and to know whether that alone is a healthy decision. And that's just one decision in our big, selection of decisions we have to make about interacting with healthcare. But home health is part of that for us. So that's been a tough decision. We have had a scare where one nurse had contact with a patient who had COVID, and we had to do the 2-week lockdown with no one in our homes and provide all the care ourselves. And it was absolutely exhausting because my son does require some care around the clock. And that doesn't make me feel any safer about my own health when I'm exhausted and I feel like my immune system might be taking a hit. And so, it's just trying to figure out where that balance is between safety and danger that's so hard right now. And I don't think we have it figured out. We don't have something that feels safe to us. It just feels adequate. And maybe that has to be enough at the moment.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, Sherry, I know as a cancer survivor, I'm sure you have a lot of the same anxieties that many people have, especially those of us who are in these quote unquote high risk groups. So, love to hear your feelings about what's happening now with the reopening and how that impacts you, and what ways you wish you had more information, perhaps.
Thank you for having me. I think this is a great forum, so I'm excited to be a part of it. So honestly, this has been, I think for most people, and especially for me, this roller coaster ride. We've had 3 months, which has felt like a lot longer than that in terms of the things that we've had to go through mentally. And at the beginning, so just to back up, I mean, I've had cancer twice. I was diagnosed at age 25, so really young, with Hodgkin's lymphoma, and had a lot of treatment that at the time was state of the art, but then, it became clear that the treatment that was given was too much, because people down the road were starting to have late effects, secondary cancers, heart problems, a whole host of things. And so I've been followed up. That was 30 plus years ago. And I've been followed up regularly for those late effects. In addition, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, which years later, which was considered a late effect as well. So I've had quite a bit of treatment, and but I've been in remission for a really long time, and knock on wood, I feel really good. And so I think at the beginning, sometimes I forget what I've been through. So I was sort of thinking my risk was like the same as anybody, my age. And, I'm in relatively good health. And even at the beginning, I thought like, oh, I just want to get it so that I can be done with it and not be so anxious about like, am I going to get it? How am I going to get it? And then that turned into, no, I don't ever want to get this, because all the media stories that were so horrific about COVID were really, really scary. And now we're in this phase of, some quarantine fatigue, and the weather's nice, at least where I live in the Northeast, and we can go outside, and it's really easy to sort of, for a minute, kind of want to move on and forget about it. But this is the phase that I call, the risk assessment phase for all of us. And that's when you sort of sit back and think like, well, what is my risk? And up until this point, I really have had no communications with my doctor. So like, I really didn't know what to think. And because of a recent test that I had, I started to communicate with a few doctors, and I, asked them what my risk was. And, the response was that I'm at a high risk of serious complications from COVID. And so the reality is that I should be really, really careful. And I think the hard part about that is, what does that mean? Especially as we're opening things up. Does that mean I need to stay sort of in this regular like quarantine, social distance, or do I have a little bit more flexibility? And that's where it's been really tough, because I really don't know what that means. And I think for now it's easy, I think, because I'm so used to this routine, to keep it going. But I think the question is, how long do I have to keep this going? And it's just that sense of risk. And, luckily I don't have young children in my house, but I do have, boys in their 20s who, one I haven't seen since December, and one who's been living with us, but now he's left and he wants to come back. And I have to deal with sort of those risks of a young person who might, feel more invincible, and sort of track their interactions. And so it's been stressful. And like I said, I think it's more about, how to move forward, in the short term, and how to move forward in the long term with very little guidance from physicians. And, in all fairness, I understand they're not quite clear either, but you're just grasping for some type of direction that you just don't have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the name of the game. It's just not having that direction, and I think a lot of confusion from patients and caregivers and communities, but also the medical community, I think, also is struggling. Like, how do we communicate? What are the best, they're so used to, we have to have our best practices, and where's our evidence? And this has evolved and changed so many different times, and it's really difficult, I think, to get a hold of it. But I'll always say, just like we say in patient family engagement, communication, 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 it's key. And I think I understand and can appreciate the emergency of it all and going into that mode of, okay, we've got to just tackle this. But I think what got missed, big part that got missed was that communication, and who would be responsible for that communication to especially those who are in these high risk groups. And I think that's where, if that's one thing I would suggest to, to healthcare systems, is really, figure out your communication strategy and make sure that that communication strategy is also equitable. Like, you can't just have virtual town halls when you have people who do not have internet access, or have the device that they could utilize to do that, or don't have the comfort or the language to be able to engage in that way. And so how do we, look outside that box in terms of communication, and how do we keep it consistent and clear? I think that's clear. So as you both think about this, what do you think are good strategies to really provide that information that we're really seeking? Or perhaps saying, this is what we know now, and this is all I can tell you now. I can't tell you what may happen in 3 to 6 months, right? I may not have those answers, but here's what I'm committed. I'm committed to communicating with you. And when I do have that information, there will be some type of strategy that this information is communicated. So Nikki, if you want to start, and then Sherry, just share with me, maybe some strategies or things that you guys have heard about personally or in the field that you might want to share with the audience today.
Sure. One of the thoughts I have is that it has to be multimodal, whatever you're doing. You can't just use internet, because we don't want to go into this reconstruction of healthcare, creating disparities like we did in the initial construction of healthcare. So I think one of the biggest things is making sure that if you have people missing from representation, or you're not talking to certain patients, that we make an effort to make sure that that gets done. We can't keep leaving voices out of healthcare that have been left out of healthcare, because that's why we have the system we have. And so I think that's super important, and thinking about health literacy as a strategy as well, because we sometimes get those communications from a hospital and you need a master's degree to read it. And I don't think that can be acceptable anymore. We know we're not talking to the majority of our populations that we're serving. And I really feel like we need to take a look at how we're communicating and making sure that that's accessible to every patient. And that means multiple languages. That means literacy levels are evaluated, all of that. We cannot assume that people are just going to catch up with the latest cutting edge way of communication.
Great point. Sherry, what strategies do you think may be important and you could share?
So my passion has been around lending my voice to healthcare professionals, so that they make decisions by listening to what patients have to say, if that makes sense. And, I think this is one of those critical times where it's really important to talk to patients, and to talk to as many patients from different backgrounds and different conditions as possible, sort of as Nikki said, with respect to different communication techniques, et cetera. Because things like what I just said, some of my anxieties and fears, like, no one's asked me, and I'm sure most people, how they're feeling right now. There's been almost like no outreach other than, general communications that I've gotten from like a hospital or a clinic about their procedures or whatever, but, just didn't really connect with the things that I was most concerned about. And I wanted to just mention that Nikki and I, as well as one other person from the PXPF, co-wrote an article that was just published in Becker's Hospital Review. And it was called "We Must Partner with Patients as We Redefine Healthcare in This Post-COVID-19 Era." And we talk a lot about, maybe a little more articulately than I just said, but we talk a lot about why it's really important to partner with patients as we move forward, and redefine how healthcare is going to move forward. forward. And, it's things like, what would it take to make me feel safe to go back to the clinic or to go back to the hospital for a test? What matters most to patients? And so in that article, we tried to capture why it's really important to partner with patients, and not just have an opinion or two that's heard, but more really work together on some of these issues. Because I feel like, in my experience, what hospitals often think patients want and need is very different than what they want and need. And so, I'm just going to keep pushing this idea as long as I'm on this earth, because I just think there's a disconnect, and learning to be my own advocate. And I'm sure it's probably the same with Nikki and with you too. You get a little bit more information, but most people don't know how to push for that information. And that's just, it's not right. So that's a little bit of a few of my thoughts.
Thank you. I'm glad I'm glad you both brought up a few issues that I wanted to just maybe pull out in our last few minutes. I'm going to make a pretty bold statement, and I'm sure some people may or may not agree with me, but if we look at patient-family engagement as a whole, I think we've taken many, many steps back in the last few months. And I say that because, exactly to your point, Sherry, you should be talking to patients and families. And sadly, that's not happening. I've been on, just personally, I won't even get into professional calls, but personal calls for my own daughter's care, whether it's town halls, on the phone or online, or emails I've tried to send. And no one ever asks, well, what do you think? How are you feeling? And I think, that's the essence of partnering with patients and families, caregivers, and communities is really having that information so that we can make decisions together and strategize together. And I think, unfortunately, because of how everything came about, we went into this emergency mode, right? And everything else was like, nope, don't have time for any of this. And I think that also points to that, patient-family engagement really is not just a strategy. It has to be hardwired into the infrastructure. And when it's not, this is what happens. And so, in these last couple of minutes, what would you suggest, to healthcare systems and even community leaders? I was on a phone call, town hall, with our county executive and Department of Health. They were having a call in. There was like 40,000 plus residents on the line, but you never heard from anybody during that call that said, okay, let me hear what you guys think. How are we handling this? What do you need to be more reassured and safe? So in these last few minutes, I'd like to hear, how can we inspire that partnership again? How do we get those voices there? And how do we also make room and make space for voices that continue not to be part of these discussions?
Sherry, I can start. I think that a lot of it is that we have to go beyond what we were doing before. What we were doing before was already not perfect, and I don't want to return, like we have said before. I don't want to go back. I want to do something new that's innovative. And our old ways of engaging are not necessarily the most effective right now. I mean, we can talk about PFACs and committees and all these different things that were not perfect before, and certainly are going to be less perfect when people feel less mobile, when people are having financial difficulties that would prevent them from interacting in an in-person basis, when there are restrictions on all of that. Some of the ways that we used to meet and gather and provide patient voices are not going to work for the future. So first, I think innovation is needed. And again, Sherry, like you said, we have to hear from patients and families about what we want. A hospital can put up this shiny new thing that engages patients, and if it's not meaningful to the patients, it's still not going to do enough, and especially if it's only meaningful to a small segment of patients. So I think it needs to be a co-creation, and it also needs to be very collaborative, and it has to include lots of different circumstances. We need to be more inclusive in general, and I think that was what was missing already, and we cannot create a future doing the same thing we did before.
I mean, Nikki really said it all. Not at all. I mean, this is a tough nut to crack for sure. But we just really need to be creative about how we find patients and families and talk to them, because asking the same people over and over again is not representative at all. And as you know, with COVID, it's like we have certain groups of people that are hit harder than others, and we need to go into those communities and talk to people, and find out how we can do better. And so I don't really want to repeat what you said, because I thought you said it really well. But like I said, I feel like our voice needs to be heard. It's very impactful, and we need to work in partnership as we move forward in this environment. And I'm just going to do a quick plug for my blog in case anyone's interested. I do write a blog called Best Life After Cancer, and it can be found at sherryberman.net. I find that writing helps me really crystallize my thoughts, and it's also a really good outlet during this time of anxiety as well. And so I hope to, continue writing as not only, a creative activity, but to really be able to crystallize my thoughts. And I think venues like this, where we're talking and potentially writing afterwards, will help to, get our thoughts out there as well.
Great. Well, we are at the end of our time. As always, wish we could continue the talking till probably tomorrow, but we're going to end it there. Thank you, Nikki and Sherry. I hope that we can continue these discussions, because obviously this is an evolving situation, but I do hope that we've brought some inspiration to really renew those partnerships and make space for those partnerships that we have not, unfortunately, made space for. And communication is key. So I hope that that's a message that people can take back today. Thank you all for joining us for Tuesday Table Talk. I will post on my LinkedIn page the Table Talk, along with the article that Sherry referenced, as well as her website for her blog. Please do check it out and give her a shout out. And Sherry and Nikki, if you could just hold on tight for a few seconds while we end the live stream, and I will be back on once that's done. And thank you, everyone. Hope you have a great day, and hope to see you at the next Tuesday Table Talk every Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern. Thanks, everyone.